And so I just, because of my own birds and my own interest in the birds, I just said, well, okay, I'm going to start this little documentary, and suddenly, whoosh.
Big, yeah.
Oh yeah, so I've like opened a can of worms. So just, if you could tell me how this started.
Sure. Well, so the parrot petition, I mean, if I really start at the beginning, a big part of the clinic's work was trying to get species on the endangered species list for a variety of clients. Most often it began with some client who'd already written a petition and either had been ignored by the Fish and Wildlife Service or rejected by the Fish and Wildlife Service and wanted to sue. Most often it was just flat out ignored because the service was running a system where it wasn't just file a petition, it was file a petition and then go get yourself a lawyer, because unless you sue us, we're going to ignore your petition. So, we did a lot of that work, and one thing that became apparent to me was there are way more things that should be protected than actually are. If you look at other entities that rank endangered species, like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, it's commonly called the IUCN, they have tens of thousands of species listed as needing protection in various categories. The United States has about 1,500. So maybe we're 10, 15% of what should be protected is actually legally protected. And the speed at which we were getting the list correct was pathetic in terms of the, getting just an accurate list. And so you had to file all these lawsuits to get through delay and it being ignored, and then often you'd get a negative decision. You'd have to try to reverse it. And it could take up to 6 lawsuits to get a species on the list. Normally it doesn't take all 6, but it almost never doesn't take at least a couple. And so what I wanted to do legally was make it easier and find some species where the International Union for the Conservation of Nature had already said, these things are critically endangered, they're going extinct, and just try to get the American government to recognize, look, someone else already did all the work, they've peer-reviewed it, all you have to do is agree with them, and your job is done. Basically just double-check their work, and you can get your list more accurate. And so I wanted to say, let's use the IUCN to get species.
And that's the
International Union for the Conservation of Nature.
Okay.
It's probably the biggest international biodiversity group. It's a non-governmental organization, but funded a lot by governments and supported and used by government. It has like observer status at the UN, like the top notch. Then I went to Costa Rica, and my daughter, again, same one who talked me out of eating meat, she knew that I tried to protect endangered species, and when she was in Costa Rica, she wanted to see a scarlet macaw. She had a little bird list and was very desirous of seeing a scarlet macaw. And she read up about them, and she found that lots of them had been killed, particularly during the Nicaraguan Civil War, for human consumption. I think they were called rainbow chickens, and the numbers vary, but thousands were killed just to be eaten. And she also read about the captive pet trade, and we were finally able to see scarlet macaws in the wild. She was delighted. It was one of her favorite things on the whole trip, was finding scarlet macaws in the wild. We went to a rehabilitation center where they were trying to slowly, over generations, re-release scarlet macaws from captivity to the wild, so that the parents had been captured. Who knows? The parents were released from captivity, taken to the rehabilitation center, but can't be released directly to the wild because they're somewhat dependent on humans. But their kids can. And so over generations, they sort of, the scarlet macaws are leaving this little rehabilitation center and recolonizing the jungle. But again, she learned about the captive bird trade, and then finally we went to a display at the zoo in San Jose, and it was just a wall made out of crushed bird cages, and very stridently saying, catching birds from the wild is causing extinction, and urging people not to participate in the captive bird trade. And all that sort of developed in my daughter a real passion to say, we need to do something to help macaws. And she said, well, this is your job. Why don't you do something to help the scarlet macaw? And so when I got back, the two things came together in my mind. There's all these macaw species and parrot species and cockatoo species, which international scientific organizations recognize are going extinct. And there's really no question that their populations are plummeting in the wild and are sometimes at critically low levels, like a few hundred for some of the species we're talking about. Or even the species of which there's still thousands, the trajectory is like that, and you can sort of anticipate where it's headed if we don't do something different. And it's habitat loss and the captive bird trade. I mean, overwhelmingly those two things figure again and again. And so what I asked my students to do in the clinic was go to the IUCN and find the parrots that the IUCN has identified as critically endangered or endangered, or that have been listed on CITES, the convention, as threatened by trade, and that the United States government has ignored. And let's file a comprehensive petition addressing what we call the caged bird trade, to try to get the United States government to add these species to the endangered species list. And so that's where the petition started from, was basically a series of complaints registered by my daughter about why we weren't doing anything to protect these macaws that she found so beautiful when she saw them.
Okay. What is the process? I mean, how does a species get listed? And you talked about the thick-billed parrot, I think. And if you could do that, it kind of explain the legal process.
Sure. So generally speaking, the Endangered Species Act has a citizen petition process, which means any citizen can petition to put a species on the list or take a species off the list, and the government owes them a response. So that's the one channel to listing, is the citizen petition process. And I'll come back to how it works.
Okay.
The other channel to listing is the government could do it on its own. I mean, the government doesn't have to wait to be asked by a citizen to do that. In reality, the government doing it on its own has been a dead letter for 30-some years. Way back in the 1970s, when the Endangered Species Act was first passed in 1973, the government actually listed some species on its own. And most of them were recommended by the Smithsonian Institution, or had appeared on earlier lists of endangered species, or were recognized by CITES and the IUCN. And so initially, the government actually did its own work. Subsequently, because listing endangered species forces protection of one degree or another, the government quit, because it's just, I think it's a predictable but sad bureaucratic response, is that the safest thing for these bureaucratic agencies to do is nothing. Or if they are going to do something, it's safe for them to turn around and blame whoever petitioned it. And so they prefer that route. And some of the things my clients, or I have worked on petitions over the year, someone inside the government actually asked us to do it, to give them an excuse to do the right thing. And so, though in theory, legally, there's two ways to get on the endangered species list: the government acting of its own accord, or citizen petition process. 99% of the stuff in the last 20 years has come through the citizen petition process. And that process is stepped. It's actually quite rigorous. But if it worked correctly, as written, within 90 days, the government would tell you if your petition presented substantial information that would convince a reasonable person what you wanted may be warranted. Pretty low threshold. Reasonable person may be warranted. If they said yes, you've convinced a reasonable person, then the government is supposed to do what's called a status review. That's would be completed, in theory, 12 months from the date you sent the petition. And then they'd give you a more positive decision. Warranted, meaning not warranted, you're just wrong, we've checked it out. Or warranted but precluded, which is again this very Orwellian bureaucratic, which means, yeah, we should protect it, but we're not going to because we're busy working on something else. And that was a horrible problem for a number of years. But assuming you got warranted, then within a year, which could be extended for an additional 6 months if there was